August 1945. Soldiers came home to a country that had remade itself in their absence. Factories that had built bombers now retooled for refrigerators and automobiles, and the unemployment catastrophe that economists predicted never arrived. Instead, pent-up consumer demand, 4 years of rationing and war bonds, exploded into one of the most sustained economic expansions in American history. 16 million veterans flooded back into civilian life, and Congress had already prepared the ground for them. The Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, the GI Bill, offered low-interest home loans, college tuition, and unemployment insurance on a scale the federal government had never attempted before. More than 2 million veterans enrolled in colleges and universities within just a few years, reshaping American higher education permanently. But not all veterans came home to the same America. Black soldiers who had fought in segregated units returned to segregated neighborhoods, segregated schools, and in parts of the South, systematic violence that carried no legal consequence. The contradiction, fighting fascism abroad while enforcing racial hierarchy at home, would fester for the next 2 decades, and some returning veterans would become the organizers of the civil rights movement. That pressure was already building, even as the ticker tape fell. Overseas, the architecture of the post-war world was being hammered together at conference tables. At Yalta in February 1945 and Potsdam that summer, the Allied powers divided Europe into informal spheres, though neither side admitted it so plainly. By 1947, Soviet-backed governments were consolidating control across Eastern Europe, and the word that would define the next 4 decades entered diplomatic vocabulary: containment. The man who gave that doctrine its name, State Department analyst George Kennan, believed the Soviet system would eventually collapse under its own internal contradictions. He was right. He just underestimated the weight by about 40 years. In March 1947, President Truman stood before a joint session of Congress and asked for military and economic aid to Greece and Turkey, both under pressure from communist movements. The speech went further than the immediate request. It declared that the United States would support free peoples resisting subjugation anywhere on Earth. This was not a cautious foreign policy commitment. It was a blank check, and Congress co-signed it. Then came the Marshall Plan, formerly the European Recovery Program, announced in June 1947. Over roughly 4 years, the United States channeled more than $12 billion into rebuilding Western European economies. The strategic logic was blunt. Hungry, ruined nations were fertile ground for communist parties, and Western Europe had plenty of both hunger and ruin. The plan worked, and it also created trading partners whose prosperity would anchor American exports for a generation. Generosity and self-interest occupied the same envelope. At home, fear moved faster than policy. In 1947, Truman signed an executive order establishing loyalty review boards for federal employees. The House Un-American Activities Committee had been investigating suspected communists since the late 1930s, but now its hearings found a mass audience. Hollywood writers were subpoenaed, careers dissolved overnight, and the genuine presence of Soviet espionage, confirmed later by declassified intelligence, made paranoia and legitimate concern almost impossible to separate in real time. Then 1949 arrived, and the anxiety sharpened into something closer to dread. In August, the Soviet Union tested its first nuclear device, years ahead of American intelligence estimates. Weeks later, Mao Zedong proclaimed the People's Republic of China. 2 events, 2 months apart. Within 6 months, Senator Joseph McCarthy would claim to hold a list of communists inside the State Department, and American political life would enter one of its most convulsive periods. The timing alone felt, to many Americans, like a verdict. Korea arrived next. June 1950, North Korean forces crossing the 38th parallel in force. Truman committed American troops without a formal declaration of war, calling it a police action under United Nations authority. The war killed more than 36,000 American service members and wounded roughly 100,000 more, ended in an armistice rather than a peace treaty, and left the peninsula divided almost exactly where it had been before. It is sometimes called the Forgotten War, which is less a historical judgment than an act of collective avoidance. What this period reveals is not a nation reluctantly dragged into global confrontation, but one that was, in profound ways, constitutionally suited to it. Economically powerful enough to sustain an empire of bases and aid packages, ideologically primed to cast every local conflict as a global struggle, and anxious enough about its own internal contradictions that an external enemy provided useful coherence. The Cold War did not happen to America. America, in important ways, helped build the conditions that made it possible, and then spent the next 4 decades living inside what it had made.